Welcome to the Melvin Breakdown, where we take a look at a new Magic the Gathering mechanic, or look back at an old one, and see how it holds up. Today we're looking at Mentor, the Boros Legion's combat mechanic from Guilds of Ravnica. But does might make right, or does Mentor fall short? Let's take a look. Please note this isn't strictly a review. We examine our mechanics on the following 4 criteria: utility, resonance, prevalence, and power. Some of these might be more important to you as a player than others, and you can draw your own conclusions from what we discover. But let's start with how it works. Mentor is a keyword that refers to a triggered ability. Like most, but not all triggered abilities, Mentor functions on the battlefield, and is exclusively found on creatures. Mentor means, whenever this creature attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature with power less than this creature's power. For example, let's say I'm attacking you with my Barging Sergeant, my Sandbar Serpent, my Argent Sphinx, and my Blurry Beeble. The Sergeant has a power of 4 and Mentor, which means that when I attack, I can target any creature with power less than 4 and give it a counter. In this case, only the Serpent and the Beeble are legal targets. If, for whatever reason, the Sergeant's power was higher, then I could also choose the Argent Sphinx. However, I can only ever choose one creature to get the counter. It's about as simple as a mechanic can get, combining as it does 2 of the core mechanics of the game, combat and +1/+1 counters. These are some of the first things that players learn about Magic, making Mentor, appropriately, a very teachable mechanic. That isn't to say it doesn't have its quirks. In particular, much has been made of the attacking with multiple creatures clause. Let's try a new scenario. I'm attacking you with 2 Barging Sergeants and 1 Sandbar Serpent. The Serpent is now the only legal target for both Mentor triggers, and one resolves no problem, but when the other tries to resolve, it sees that the Serpent now has a power of 4. That matches the Sergeant's power, which means it's no longer a legal target. When a spell or ability discovers upon resolution that all its targets are illegal, it fails to resolve. It's not the end of the world, but it can lead to some unfortunate misplays. Mentor can only ever appear on creatures, but that's okay. Creatures make up more than half of the average standard set, so they should certainly get their own keywords, and despite what some might say, a perceived increase in focus on creature combat does not make Magic a less complex or strategically deep game. Mentor treads this line quite well. There's a good deal of planning you can put into your deck building and piloting to ensure you get maximum value out of your creatures. In fact, Mentor is just straight value, but requires careful consideration to work its magic. And while the result of all this planning is always basically the same, incrementally bigger creatures, there is at least some variance to be found by trying out different creatures as the Mentor targets. Evasion and Lifelink in particular are highly sought after payoffs. On the design space front, Guilds of Ravnica kind of explores everything you can do with Mentor by putting it on high power creatures, high power low toughness creatures, low power creatures you can then buff, token generators, haste creatures, and so on. That's good news for the mechanic as it stands because it got a good treatment, but it does diminish its chances of returning. The Boros Legion have had a tough time of it. Their first mechanic in Ravnica City of Guilds was Radiance, which was, bad. As Mark Rosewaters said time and again, the biggest problem with it was that it didn't feel very Boros-y. The conceit of matching up colours with what you're playing has almost zero resonance with the feeling of a giant military faction. Fast forward to Return to Ravnica, and the Boros enjoy a brief moment in the sun when Battalion offers them a meaningful identity. And now, with Mentor, there's a feeling that the Boros just focus too much on combat. Honestly, you're damned if you do. Anyway, of course, Mentor fits great with the Boros identity. It also feels good to play, especially when you're staring down a wall of opposing creatures and realise that you can force some favourable trades by doing the one thing aggro players love to do: flunge. Mentor can feel bad occasionally if you only have one creature or their creatures are just so big it doesn't make a difference, but on the whole, it feels good to fight. Boros is certainly on show in the Guilds of Ravnica limited environment, and building a Mentor deck is not a hard task. There are incredibly obvious Mentor targets like Swiftblade Vindicator, which is just begging to be powered up, and Freshfaced Recruit, whose flavour speaks for itself, but the payoffs are less flashy than the other decks in the format, and more fragile to boot. It's okay to put a single Mentor card into an unrelated deck, Parhelion Patrol plays well with Selesnya and occasionally wants a high-powered creature to fling at the opponent. In Limited especially, no deck is getting by without creatures, so improving those creatures is a valuable, if somewhat constrained, task. And despite the slight rules weirdness, Mentor is perhaps the most obviously synergistic mechanic with itself. It encourages you to go wider with the aforementioned targets and just pile up the counters. At some point all your creatures become too big for it to work anymore, but by that point you've probably won anyway. The Mentor deck is well positioned in Limited, and some cards even made a splash in Constructed. That's partly down to its legendary bombs, Aurelia and Tajik, but if Boros has an issue, it's the fact that it is not mono red or mono white. Maybe that's a little unfair, but with those decks being so fast and so prevalent, it's hard to make a case for a pure value mid-range mechanic like Mentor. Legion Warboss has seen play in the mono-red deck, spewing out tokens, but other than that, Mentor is arguably the Guilds of Ravnica mechanic to see the least play in Standard. One reason this might be is that in Limited, you're often forced to play subpar creatures, so a mechanic that slowly improves them is desirable. On the other hand, in Standard, you don't want to put a bad creature in your deck in the first place, so Mentor has less desirable targets. And since, with the possible exceptions of Aurelia and the also expensive Light of the Legion, the Mentor creatures have pretty low toughnesses, you rarely end up in board states where you actually want to use them. It's not that Mentor has no impact, but in constructed formats, there just isn't enough to keep you hooked. On that sour note, it's worth returning to the fact that Mentor is a huge flavour win for a faction that has struggled to find an identity in the past. It's about more than just punching, it's about improvement and training. It hits a sweet spot for both players who want their mechanics to represent something in the game's world, and players who just want to turn cards sideways. Given a theoretical increase in design space, I can certainly see Mentor returning to fight another day.